Yes, we are on record now.
Okay, yeah, because I was thinking about people who could not make it today. And I think that for the purpose of movement building and doing political organizing, you always want to reach as many people as possible. So that's why I took that time out. So let me just reread, since I was a bit distracted wondering about the recording issue. I'm going to reread a part of this quote. The way we describe this problem matters. For example, systemic racism clearly conveys the pervasiveness of racial oppression, but white supremacy goes further by indicating that there is a rigid nexus of power that protects and enforces it. And that's the thing about white supremacy and using the term white supremacy that is different from any of these other terms that you would use. It's about power. It is a system of power. It is a system that actually determines what goes on in our society. White supremacy is the engine that runs the nation. It runs its political economy, its social structure, its culture. It runs everything. I was reading an interesting article this morning in the New York Times about a longtime Black intellectual, retired, our emeritus professor, Adolph Reed, who was disinvited from speaking to the New York City chapter of Democratic Socialists of America. It's a very interesting article. I suggest that you find it. And what the article was about was like, is it class or is it race? And of course, I'm arguing with the article as I'm reading it, because you can't really talk about class in the United States and not talk about race. It's not possible. And I also read, I'm not that familiar with his work. He is a Marxist. And it said that he had been critical of identity politics. And like, I thought I need to find out more about that, because if you don't have an intersectional perspective, then you might just want to pick one. I think that the reason, and again, this is an argument I was having with this article that is in the New York Times. I think the reason it's important to address white supremacy as opposed to only addressing class is because people are being lynched and murdered and brutalized because of white supremacy. So to say that there's many white people or more poor people, white people who are poor than there are people of color, all well and good. But like when a white person who is poor gets pulled over by the police, are they in absolute fear for their lives? And if the answer is no, then you have to look at why a Black poor person who gets pulled over is in terror and fear of their lives. And I just thought it was just a really interesting article to me, because that's an argument that's been going on in the left for some time. I'm concerned about white supremacy during this particular period, and I'm talking about in the last few months, but have been always, but particularly during this period, because so many egregious things are happening. And I think that if you don't talk about the whys of the why, the source and the reason why things are happening, there's no way you can solve it. You can't solve something that you can't name and define. And like kind of circling around the edges of our racial chaos that we have in the United States, that's why we never get anywhere, because we never really go to the root of it all. And as I maintain, the root is white supremacy. This is an area that we're going to talk about later, but since it's on this page, I'll read it now so I won't forget. One of the things that we're going to talk about, and this is not the only session we're doing, we're going to do at least one more. I think we're really up for 2 more of these sessions. But one of the things that I said that we could talk about, and we might talk about more in subsequent sessions, is how to desegregate your political organizing. And what I just wanted to share is that the best way to desegregate your organizing is to desegregate your life. Most white people, even so-called progressive ones, do not do this, and they do not even think about doing this. And there's going to be a little quiz. Yes, indeed, you signed up for this webinar, and you're going to get a quiz. There's going to be a little quiz later that's going to illustrate what I am getting at when I talk about desegregating your life. Let me just read a couple more things from my article, which is titled "The Problem is White Supremacy," which I wrote because of what was going on in relationship to racial terrorism at the time. I started writing it a few days after George Floyd was lynched. But I also wrote it because the talking heads, even in the so-called liberal media, the talking heads that were being allowed to talk about these issues, none of them ever talked about white supremacy. They might mention white supremacy, but no one ever got into it. And white supremacy was kind of like a synonym for systemic racism. They never dug deep into like, what is that thing, white supremacy? So that's what I've been thinking about a lot in the last few months. So here's a couple of excerpts, a couple more excerpts from that article. Toxic as such beliefs are, white supremacy is not merely individual delusions of being superior to Black people. It's not, it doesn't rest in the individual totally or solely. Institutionalized white supremacy does not need individual bigotry in order to function, because it is a universal operating system that relies on entrenched patterns and practices to consistently disadvantage people of color and privileged whites. Now, this may sound like very strange, outrageous, because isn't what goes on in the United States around race, around certain people having very negative attitudes about certain other people? Isn't that what it is all about? That's what most people think in the United States. They think that when you talk about racism, you're talking about how do people from different groups relate to each other, how do they get along with each other or not get along with each other. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. I often say when I'm doing presentations, and I've been talking about this for decades, publicly talking about these issues for decades, I often say that if every white person in the United States tomorrow decided that they were going to treat every person of color with decency and respect, we would still have white supremacy. And as I said, that may be hard to grasp. Here's an example. There's a reason that Black patients don't get sufficient pain medication from young doctors. I'm not talking about people who got their medical degrees, 40 years ago. Newly minted MDs who are still involved probably in residency training, whatever stage they are, but they're young people. This is a study that was done just a few years ago, maybe 2016, 2012, I can't remember the exact date, but not very long ago. And what they found out is that these newly minted MDs, that at least a third of them thought that Black people felt less pain and had thicker skin than white people. Now, these are people with medical degrees who were born in the late 20th century, and yet they think these things. That's not an individual situation going on. What's happening with our pandemic of people of color, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous, suffering so much more from the pandemic, from COVID-19, both incidents of illnesses and also deaths, number of illnesses, number of people with the virus, number of people who died, and the numbers, as I said, are staggeringly disproportional. It's not because there's some individual somewhere who decided that. It's because we have systemic racial disparities that are quite aligned with and that are absolutely approved of by a system of white supremacy. So here's the last section, paragraph I'm going to read, or a couple of sentences I'm going to read to you. from that article, and I hope that you've all had a chance to read it, and I would love to hear questions about the article specifically when we get to our question and answer period. This is about whether we will ever solve white supremacy. This is toward the end or the conclusion of that op-ed. And what I wrote in the last paragraph is, it is much more likely, however, that the powers that be will offer band-aids and half measures, thus ensuring that white supremacy remains intact. Until this nation confronts white supremacy, however, and commits to demolishing it brick by brick, police brutality, vigilante violence, and rampant inequality will continue, and America will move closer to becoming a failed state. What we get when we have these racial crises is people talk about often cosmetic solutions to what needs to happen. And I make the point in that op-ed that we have the same kind of racial dynamics now, or similar kinds of racial dynamics around police violence, extrajudicial murders of Black people, as we did back in the 1940s and earlier. It's because it's a system. So I'm going to shift now. I'm going to take a little sip of water, which you know I'm doing because you can see me doing it. And now I'm going to start talking about how did the situation get this way? How did the racial situation that we find ourselves in begin? Why in 2020, 401 years after the first Africans were brought here for the purpose of enslavement in 1619, are we still grappling with racist violence and vast inequality based upon race? The origin story of the United States is not a pretty story, as you probably know. It began with genocide, land stolen from the indigenous people who had lived here for millennia, for thousands of years. The United States was a settler colony. It became a settler nation. So just right off the bat, your ships dock or come up to the water's edge back in 1492. It's an inhabited nation, an inhabited country. And you declare that you've discovered it, and then you proceed to annihilate and to remove the people who live here. That's a racial story. If they'd met some Europeans, there were wars. There was definitely warfare, but there was just a different kind of tinge to it when they found people who they considered to be, quote, savages, end quote. So as I said, the whole situation, the whole history of the nation begins with that. And it's been rolling on ever since. One of the issues then, the major issue, not one, well, there was other issues like how do we stay alive, in a wilderness without shelter, et cetera, or food. But the major challenge that confronted those colonizers, those invaders, was how to develop a huge undeveloped continent. How could these people extract the value from this land in a primarily agricultural economy? They needed a huge labor force to get what they wanted to get out of the land, which is not subsistence or their own survival, but profit. And that's where slavery came in. We're residing on stolen land, and we have a history of unspeakable crimes against humanity. You've heard about indentured servitude and indentured servants, and that system was not ideal because indentured servants had a set term of work, and they could then, after they finished that term of work, which was often 7 years, they could be free. They were free because they had filled out the term of their indenture. They could also run away and disappear into the white population. How could you tell an indentured servant from another white person if you didn't know what was going on? Enslaving Africans and exploiting their labor and making enslavement a permanent status was diabolically efficient. Diabolically efficient. Slavery has existed wherever there has been human so-called civilizations. The Greeks enslaved people, the Romans did, all kinds of cultures and nation states, if they got to that stage of being nation states, all kinds of people, groups of people did indeed have systems of enslavement. The difference between U.S. chattel slavery and all those other systems, and people generally acknowledge that the worst system of slavery that ever existed was the one that existed in the United States, which is a huge irony given that this is a constitutional democracy. The nation that became the first constitutional democracy, with a written constitution, also had the worst system of enslavement of any that ever existed. Much like with indentured servitude and other systems of enslavement, people could actually escape from, not escape from slavery. I didn't mean to say escape. People could actually change their status. They could get out of being slaves. Slaves were often the results. Being enslaved was often the result of wars that were fought, and the people who were conquered were enslaved. But people could actually change their status, and the status was not necessarily passed on to their offspring. Whereas in the United States, if your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved. And if you were enslaved, your offspring would be enslaved. And that's like a no holds barred, airtight system, no exit, you know. And the level of cruelty and sadism, most people are not taught about how horrific the conditions were of being enslaved in the United States, because guess what? White supremacy does not want you to know. I heard recently someone say, and it's so accurate and true, that in the United States, generally history is not taught. What is actually taught is nostalgia. So if you're teaching nostalgia, you don't really tell the truth about the abysmal sadism and cruelty of enslavement. I found out some things about enslavement when I went to Cuba back in the 1990s, because in a museum there, a museum of African history and culture in Havana, Cuba, they actually had some of the shackles and other things that they use to keep people in chains and enslaved and under control, like iron mask, or not mask so much, but like a kind of a cage that you would put over someone's head with a lock, so that, you know, it was just, you know, I saw things that, of course, that never have been shown or seen here. Maybe the Museum of African American History and Culture, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, has some of that. I unfortunately have not visited. But as I said, generally people do not talk about the horrific reality of those origins. The economic roots of racism, as I said, that's how the system began. The economic roots of racism still advantages people who have white skin privilege. One of the things to understand is that the ideology of white supremacy resulted from the exploitation of enslavement and the exploitative system of enslavement, not the other way around. Slave owners needed to develop an ideology that would justify what under any other circumstances would be sanctioned and condemned. Criminal acts that were not viewed as criminal if the victims were not white. Criminal acts that were not considered to be criminal if the victims were not white. And here's an example of that. Kneeling on a man's neck as he begged for his life while knowing that you are being filmed. That's a perfect example of a criminal act that at least by that person and the 3 other police officers who were watching was not viewed as criminal or wrong, because the person it was happening to, George Floyd, was not white. As I said, some people think that the reason we have such a horrible racial environment in the United States and such a horrible racist system in the United States is because we have such horrible racist ideology and ideas. Oh, so the white people who came from Europe, they were really, 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 really racist. And so then they decided to start a system of enslavement. No, that's not how it happened at all. They had those imperatives around labor and being able to exploit the land for profit through other people's labor. And they tried different things. And what eventually worked was abducting people from the African continent, bringing them here and making them permanently enslaved. So it was the economic imperative that created the system and led to the system of enslavement. And then subsequently, they had to come up with an ideology to justify and to explain why in the world they were treating people this way. And so they had to decide that this was a different kind of group of people. They weren't fully human. They were savages. They were not Christians, blah, 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 blah. And that's, how it all, came about. We are still operating under that ideology, and we're still operating with the repercussions of that system of economic exploitation, which is what enslavement and slavery was about. Notice that I used the term enslaved people as opposed to slaves, because we do not reduce people who were enslaved to just that category. These were enslaved people, not just slaves. So we use the term enslaved instead of slave to talk about the people who endured the trials of the damned under that system. And of course, that's my heritage. I'm a Black person whose people are from who are from the United States, not from the United States originally, of course, they are from Africa, but I don't have Caribbean or African roots. Our Central America, our South American, our roots. My roots are here, and that means that people in my family experience the kinds of things that I am describing, although I know no details, because people in my family did not talk about those things, even though my grandmother was born only around 20 years after the Civil War ended. My grandmother was born in 1886. So her mother undoubtedly had been enslaved, but they never talked about that. That's probably why one of the many reasons I decided to devote my life to African American literature and African American studies. So to do a fast forward then through US history post-Civil War. Reconstruction was a period from 1865 to 1877. And that was a very, very unique period within the history of the United States, because it was a time when Black people had rights that they had not had previously, and where Black people actually had the franchise, and to the degree that a number of Black people were elected both in a local, state, and federal, on the federal level. So there were Black people, men, of course, since women could not vote, there were Black men serving in Congress during that period of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, which is quite amazing. As people have pointed out, we had the vote, we lost the vote, and then we had to get it back. And that happened, getting it back happened during my lifetime. People marked the institution of full voting rights to the Black population, to the Black community, as 1965. Guess what I was doing in 1965? Graduating from high school and entering college. So during my lifetime, most Black people did not have access to the franchise, particularly if they lived in the old southern states of the old Confederacy. But after, in the 1870s, in 1877, Reconstruction ended. Another thing that was happening during Reconstruction is that Black people had land and acquired land. When Reconstruction ended, there were no protections for Black rights, and the white Southerners who were the advocates for the lost cause, and that's why you see the Confederate flags and the Confederate statues to this day. Some have never given up on those golden days of enslavement of Black people. They've never given up on it, and they want you to know, so they put the Confederate flags on their lawns and on their porches and on their trucks, just so you know. But that resistance then, that white resistance, brought about then the period that followed of a huge amount of domestic terrorism. That's when the Ku Klux Klan was founded and arose, and all Black rights that had been won were withdrawn and taken away. Dorothy, and I had meant to, I'm glad I'm remembering this, Dorothy Trisman, when she introduced me, talked about my love for the post office. Well, I'm a writer. I love correspondence. I love getting letters. I was a stamp collector as a nerd child. And there are just a lot of things about the post office that I love. And you can imagine how I feel now that the creature who is in the White House is doing everything possible to dismantle the Postal Service. It is horrifying. But one of the things that happened during that period, there were Black people who were indeed postmasters in towns in the South. Sometimes those Black postal workers during that era, they were either fired or lynched. They either lost their jobs, or sometimes people were so upset at the idea of a Black person being in that position of being a postal worker, a postmaster, that they just decided what they decided to do in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when they burned and bombed Black Wall Street. We'll just get rid of them because they don't like the competition. It's a system. These are examples of white supremacy. By the end of the 1800s and then in the early 1900s, a system of Jim Crow had been established. Jim Crow was a system of laws and practices that codified segregation and Black second-class citizenship in every aspect of life. Denying the vote was the highest priority because it denied political power. It denied Black political power. And that's why the vote is so contested, because if Black people can vote, then that means that they might be able to shift what happens in their city, in their county, in their village, in their state, in their nation. We can't have that. White supremacy cannot have that. There's a animated cartoon. You'll be getting a list of links to look at some point during this presentation this afternoon. A set of websites and other resources that I found to share with you. And one of them, as I said, is an animated cartoon from Equal Justice, the Equal Justice Initiative, which is such an important organization in our nation. And I had never seen it before. I was watching it last night, and it talked about how there was a Black woman, and I think she was an older Black woman, who yelled at a group of white children. And this is, I think, in the 1930s, not 1830s, 1930s, that a group of white children were throwing stones at this adult Black woman. So a group of white children who were carefully taught, and I'm quoting an Oscar Hammerstein, Rodgers and Hammerstein song from the movie South Pacific. You've got to be carefully taught. It's a song about racism. So these carefully taught white children threw stones at this adult Black woman. She reprimanded them for throwing stones at her. Later that night, they came to her house and they lynched her and burned her house down. That's white supremacy. That's how it works. But that's the kind of thing that happened. And when those kind of racial incidents of racial terrorism happen, they are not just to deal with the person who is being attacked, maimed, and killed. Those murders are warnings for the entire race. So what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, what happened to Breonna Taylor, what happened to Tony McDade, what happened to Rayshard Brooks, what happened to Tamir Rice, what happened to Philando Castile, what happened to Eric Garner, and we can go on, Sandra Bland, those are all warnings. Those are all warnings for every living Black person that this is your status, this is what can happen to you. This could be your fate. You better be careful, you better watch out. That's what terrorism is. We talk about terrorism in other places. We have our own system of terrorism. I think I referred to the Equal Justice Initiative as actually the Equal Justice Institute. As it was during slavery, Black people's status was enforced by state-sanctioned violence. Between the end of the Civil War and 1950, more than 4,400 men, women, and children were lynched. Yes, children were lynched too. So again, white supremacy. This information, this research comes from the Equal Justice Institute, and you'll be getting several links from them. They have established, Brian Stevens, the incredible Brian Stevens, his organization, they have established a lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, and they've done careful research about all of the lynchings that they could find information on, more comprehensive than any place or any other database for that. And they, as I said, have set up a memorial, and they have soil taken from the counties or from the lynching sites, from the sites of the lynchings. They have actually, if they could determine where the lynchings actually happened, they have gathered soil and put them in jars that they exhibit there. And they also have a county by county map of where these lynchings occurred. You can pick a county that you're familiar with, and you can see how many lynchings occurred. You'll be seeing a map when you look at the links that will be shared with you, and you will see that lynchings did not just occur in the South. They are concentrated in the South, but they did not just occur in the South. How does institutional white supremacy work? Here's a good example. The GI Bill after World War II was to give benefits to those who made the world safe for democracy. I'm being sarcastic. When they served and risked their lives as soldiers, sailors, armed Air Force, whatever branch. The GI Bill was their benefit that they received for having risked their lives fighting in World War II. As I said, in quotes, making the world safe for democracy, some other place, not here. One of the aspects of the GI Bill, and I'm sure some of you know about this because you have family members who benefited from it, one of the benefits of the GI Bill was to be able to afford to go to college. And how did that work for Black returning veterans? There were only a limited number of Black colleges in the United States with a limited number of seats. And the white colleges, which had more seats, were segregated during that end of World War II, mid-1940s period, and up until the time I went to college. Those private white colleges were segregated. So there were not enough places, not enough slots in institutions of higher education for Black people, Black men primarily, to take advantage of the educational benefits of the GI Bill. So yeah, it's a bill that was supposed to be beneficial to all. Was it? No, because of racism, it could not be utilized. The same was true with segregated housing. Because of redlining and other discriminatory banking practices, Black veterans were prevented from using the GI Bill to secure mortgages because banks restricted where Black people were allowed to purchase property and to live. So on paper, the GI Bill was for anyone, right? But in fact, it was not. let's see. I think I'm almost through my notes at this point, and I guess I'm going to check on the time by looking at my phone. So I can try to do that. I think this would be a good time to start asking our hearing questions and and doing Q&A. So why don't we do that? I appreciate having been able to share with you, and sorry I can't see any of you.
Okay. Yeah, Barbara, I'm going to go over some of the questions here. Here's one. Can you hear me, Barbara?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. So I'm wondering if you would respond to Bell Hook's conceptualization that the system of oppression that we have in the United States is a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy.
I think that that's accurate. I'll tell you what my nuances are for that. We do live under racial capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
We live under capitalist patriarchy. We live under white supremacy. All of these systems are running, these are different engines that are running the society and determine who's who and what's what, who gets to live a life of ease and privilege, and who is always under the gun, so to speak, because of their status and who they're considered to be and who's considered to be of worth and value, and who is considered to be of less worth and value. So yes, capitalist patriarchy, white supremacist patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, racial capitalism. These are all terms that describe these systems, and white supremacy, of course. These are all terms that describe what goes on here in the United States. What I would say, and I've always said this about patriarchy or heteropatriarchy in particular, is that this nation was not founded on the basis of heteropatriarchy. It was not. The reason I say that is because patriarchy existed elsewhere in other nations. White people in Europe, they didn't necessarily even know they were white or think of themselves as being white until they formed the United States and came to the United States because it wasn't relevant elsewhere. I think that white supremacy is much more signally defining of our political economy, of our society, and other things that have to do with power than perhaps patriarchy is, if you look at original source or cause. In other words, yes, this is a patriarchal, heteropatriarchal nation that practices violence against women, the degradation of women, the subjugation of women, the exploitation of women, and also the similar kinds of treatment of people who are gender nonconforming, not cisgendered heterosexual, people who are femme, people who are transgender. There's a whole range of people, a whole group of people. I'm part of that group as an out lesbian, and also as a woman, a cisgendered lesbian woman. So yeah, all of that is operative here, but I really feel that there's something very particular and very specific about white supremacy and shaping the nature of life in the United States that heteropatriarchy is not as signally original in doing. As I said, there was patriarchy and violence against women and subjugation of women in the old country, if you're talking about the old country being Europe, and in other societies, in Asian societies and African societies, and cultures. So it was not original to the United States. White supremacy was kind of like what we cooked up here. And I'm not saying it's more important than the other systems. I'm talking about historical causation. When the nation was forming what became the United States, because of course it was not a nation until the late 1700s, but when it was forming, there was no understood category of being queer or LGBTQIA. There was no understood category. There was punishment for something called sodomy. So it wasn't that there were not sanctions for the behavior of having sexual relationships with people of your own perceived gender. There were indeed sanctions and punishment, but people who committed those acts were not necessarily seen as a particular kind of group of people with a particular identity, a particular set of priorities, experiences, etc. They were people who sinned or either committed a crime, the crime of sodomy. So as I said, you can't really say that the United States was formed as a heteropatriarchy, because to my mind it wasn't. We could argue about that, but since it doesn't seem like anybody else gets to talk, don't hate me for saying that, please. That's just my sense of humor. But yeah, it's everybody's entitled to having a perspective about this. I'm just talking about my understanding of history, and that, as I said, patriarchy existed in other places and other continents long before the United States, what became the United States. White supremacy did not exist in similar forms in other places, and it's particular to here. But as I said, I don't really disagree with Bell Hooks' statement.
Here's one. Can you talk about false consciousness? And do you think focusing on false consciousness might help undermine the power of white supremacy?
I don't know what is meant by false consciousness and the way the question is asked.
Yeah.
Could you read it again?
Can you talk about false consciousness, and do you think focusing on false consciousness might help undermine the power of white supremacy? Maybe, yeah, I didn't quite get that either, but.
Yeah, I don't understand. Like, false consciousness is often a term that's used about if you think something is so, but it's not. So to say that wearing masks causes you to get coronavirus, that's false consciousness. Mm-hmm. To say that it's optional to wear a mask and it doesn't make any difference whether you wear a mask or not, that's false consciousness. To say that that being required to wear a mask takes away your basic rights, to me, is false consciousness. But I'm not sure exactly how we talk about false consciousness in relationship to white supremacy unless we get into stereotyping, perhaps. False consciousness is also thinking that all Black people are intellectually inferior to all white people. False consciousness is thinking that all Black people are lazy. False consciousness is thinking that Black women are angry all the time. False consciousness are angrier than other people, and that if white men, for example, are upset or angry, it's because they're justified in being so. That's a stereotype that's also put on women of all groups, not just Black women, although there's a particular trope of the angry Black woman. So I'm not sure, since the question is not completely spelled out, I'm not sure.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't quite get that, but there's a couple that I'm trying to combine here. In the effect, what would you suggest white people do in order to tackle the issue of and help combat white supremacy?
Well, it's a big undertaking. I'm glad that people ask, and we'll be talking about that in the future in other of our sessions. And don't think I have answers or all the answers by any means. But one of the things that I think is so important is to become informed about the history of what has gone on here, and how the pieces fit together. one of the things that I said previously, earlier this afternoon, is that there's that history is generally not taught, or at least not the history of race and racism is generally not taught accurately in the United States, but there is a history of nostalgia that people seem to like a lot more. In-state standards that determine like what people, young people study in school in relationship to social studies. There are only 2 states out of the 50 where the words white supremacy are even mentioned. So you have 48 states out of 50 that do not name white supremacy as something that needs to be studied. A few years ago, on the advanced placement American history test, there was subject matter, not the test, I'm so sorry, it was a curriculum. The advanced placement American history curriculum included material about white supremacy. I think the people were in Texas, they got up in arms and they closed that down. They were incensed at the idea that there would be discussions and that students would be learning about the system of white supremacy in something called an advanced placement American history class, and they got that material withdrawn from the curriculum. That's how much people don't want people to know about it. Now, let me just say something about white supremacy that I haven't quite said before. Sometimes people think that white supremacy is an attack on white people. If you read and if you did read my op-ed, one thing you should have noticed about that op-ed is that there's not a single negative word about any individual white people or about white people as a group in that op-ed. I'm writing about a system of white supremacy. I'm not singling out white people about anything. White people do have a relationship to white skin privilege, to power, and being beneficiaries of white supremacy. But it's not about attacking white people. But I think that there's enough nervousness and insecurity and freaked outness, if that's a word, a technical term. There's enough freaked outness about whiteness and race, racial issues in the United States, that just to say white supremacy makes people say, oh, no, we can't talk about that because that means that you hate white people. Oh, no, we can't talk about that. It's baloney. It's a system of white supremacy. And it's not taking individuals necessarily to task. What can people do? As I said, become informed. Read history, read literature that I define as classic Black literature. By classic, I mean the authors are no longer alive. They're deceased and they're not contemporary authors. Read those books, read those authors. You see in my article that I cite one of them, Ann Petrie, because I talk about her short story about the Harlem race riot that happened in the 1940s. Read those classic Black authors so you can find out about what was going on in the United States from a Black point of view by incredibly great artists, literary artists. And when I say read these classic writers, besides James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, that's who everybody reads nowadays, all well and good. But and fine, everybody should be reading them, but you need to read the other 300 plus classic Black writers too. And then also to read social science. One of the things we can talk about, and I don't want to, as I said, since I don't have a clock in front of me, and I should, I want to make sure that we have time to look at the quiz. And that's where we get to talk about desegregating your life. That is one of my suggestions for how to challenge white supremacy, and that is to desegregate your life. But let's take a few more questions and then we'll get to the quiz. One other thing about how to address white supremacy, you need to analyze what's going on in relationship to race where you are. And you need to be able to analyze what's going on around race, even in something called XR. Do a very, very careful analysis of like, how do we do our work? Where do we do our work? How do we define our issues? What kind of language do we use? Who do we do our work with? What kind of coalitions do we form? Do we think that disproportionate incidences of children's asthma in poor communities of color, do we see that as something that XR should be concerned about? You know, how do you define the work? Who do you do the work with, etc.? So it's complicated. We'll talk more about that in other sessions.
Well, here's a personal one, Barbara. Are you hopeful that we will be able to confront and dismantle white supremacy in the United States?
I think the jury's out on that. I've always acted as if I was hopeful. I have been committed to working for freedom and liberation since I was a teenager in Cleveland. The first movement I was involved in was the civil rights movement. And in Cleveland, like many northern cities that had active civil rights movements, the focus of the movement was on school desegregation. I myself, I'm a twin, so my sister and I, we attended desegregated schools. We went to integrated schools, but we were motivated to get involved in the fight to have school desegregation happen across the board in Cleveland, Ohio. So I've been politically active since the mid-1960s, and it hasn't happened yet. We haven't gotten rid of white supremacy yet. One of the reasons that I'm on such a tear these days, writing about white supremacy, is that it's past time for that to happen. And until people actually use accurate terminology and acknowledge how bad the situation is and how pervasive the situation is, we will never be able to solve it. So if we're just talking about inequality and equities and implicit bias, we're not going to get there. So as I said, I'm kind of on a tear, as my friends like Dorothy know, and I will continue to be on it. It's not about one person. I can't do anything by myself. That's impossible. It's about movements and movement building. And we always have to proceed as if success is possible. We also have to be patient and know that we may not see the fruits of our labor in our lifetime. So we content ourselves to that. We just keep on working and keep on learning and keep on connecting and keep on speaking out. And we push forward. One of the things I say about being a successful political activist is that you have to proceed with fervor around the issues that concern you, because you never know what historical circumstance is going to offer to you as an opportunity. So if you kind of lay down on the job and say, well, there's not much happening, it's the 1990s, there's not much happening, whatever. And then, at a certain point, Occupy happens and you're not ready for Occupy, You always have to act as if positive change is possible, and you have to be ready for when opportunities are offered. The Black Lives Matter protest that occurred in 50 states and all over the globe following the lynching of George Floyd, that was a moment, that was an opportunity. I don't hear people talking as much about what do we do about racial oppression as they were a few weeks ago, because this is a very, very short attention span culture in society. So we have to keep that going. One other thing about how you take responsibility. People talk about being allies. Think about being a co-conspirator or an accomplice. Not just an ally, but a co-conspirator or an accomplice. Those are two very trusted ways to be identified. And then also this concept of are you responsible for the mess that you were born into, which is U.S. white supremacy? Are you responsible for that? A wonderful writer named Edward Ball wrote a book in the 1990s titled Slaves and the Family. It's not on the list that I'm sharing today. That is a written list. But he discovered that he had family members who were living at that time who were the offspring of people who his ancestors had enslaved. So he went to meet and find as many people as he could who had been enslaved on the Ball family plantation. The Ball family was one of the richest slave-owning families in the entire nation. They probably owned more enslaved people than in like one of the highest numbers of slave-owning families. So he had a lot to deal with. So he was interviewed on Fresh Air with Terry Gross. She asked him, do you feel responsible for being, for that past and having that horrible history of this incredibly just, mammoth slave-owning family? And he said, I do not necessarily think that I need to feel responsible because after all, I wasn't there. He said, but I can be accountable. So he made a distinction between being responsible, like, oh no, I'm so guilty, I'm so guilty. Oh no, I'm white, I'm so guilty. No, he let that go because guilt doesn't get you anywhere. Guilt does not get you anywhere. We know that. In every phase of our lives, not just around race. Guilt is not helpful. A lot of us are very guilty about a lot of things. I would be one of them. But the thing is, guilt is not productive at the end of the day. So instead of being guilty and saying, oh yeah, I'm responsible, I'm horrible, he said, no, not responsible, I'm accountable. And that answers the question that was just raised. Why don't we go to the quiz? Because I think we're getting toward the end of our time. And we have time for more questions after we look at the quiz. So this is something I thought of just this morning. Some of it is kind of informed by the Kamala choice. Some of the questions are things that have been said in the news recently. Sorry, I'm turning my phone on so I can have a better sense of what time it is. Okay. Anyway, so, and I'm not asking it, like, you can look at the questions and you can see if you can answer them. I'll just read them and maybe I'll give you one answer just to kind of, to toy with you. Name 3 HBCUs. What do the initials HBCU mean? Why do the media keep talking about Kamala Harris's sorority? What is Central Civico? What is the Trinity Alliance? What is the name of the van that brings food to people who are homeless in Albany? What is the paper bag test? What Black publications and websites do you subscribe to and regularly read? What is Loving versus Virginia and its date? What is Black Twitter? And complete this sentence. Will this be available for people after this? Or do they, is there a way that they can have it, be emailed it or something like that? I don't know if they want it.
Yes, I could have it emailed out to the attendee list.
Okay, so I'm going to give you one. I'm going to answer the last one. And I would love to know if anybody has any ideas, but there's no way I'll know if anybody knows what the answer is to the last one. Complete this sentence. You have to be twice as good to go half as far. You have to be twice as good to go half as far. I was raised with that because the people in my family who had good sense, you can take that off the screen now. The people in my family who, of course, had good common sense, they were raising 2 Black girls. It was the mid-20th century. They came from the late 19th century and the early 20th century. They were from the Deep South. They were from the state, Georgia, which had the second highest number of lynchings of any state in the nation, except for Mississippi. So they were realists, and they were race women. And they let us know, you have to be twice as good to go half as far as a Black person. And as I say, in response to that, fortunately for us, that was not a problem. So I was very fortunate. My family raised my sister and me to be at least twice as good so that we could go half as far. Let's look at the links now.
Chat. Where the links, you mean in the chat room?
Oh, is that what you, I don't know what Chris did with them.
Yes, they should be in chat. I can put them.
Oh, okay. No, okay. Well, then the thing is, like, I have them on a piece of paper here. I'll just comment on them. Yeah, that's, they don't have to be on the screen. I wasn't, because, because of the quiz being on the screen, I was thinking that maybe same format, but that's okay. So I mentioned the little animated film for you to watch. Molly Crabapple is the illustrator for that film. It's a good film. I didn't particularly like the fact that it is animated because I think that animation always detracts from the emotional reality and the physical reality of what's being depicted. So it has good information in it. I would suggest that you Google lynching photographs, as I did last night, and look at some photographs of lynching so you know what kind of country you're living in. If you haven't looked at photographs of lynching, look at a few. Do not traumatize yourself excessively, but as well as looking at this animated, little animated film, you might want to look at some lynching photographs. They are horrifying. And I absolutely do not dwell on doing that. I want people to know what kind of country you're living in. And people have asked me, I have a friend who's gone to the museum, the lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And she's a white woman. And she told me, she told me about going. She said, "You have to go, Barbara. You have to go." I said, "I'm not going." Just like, and I didn't say that because of the pandemic and not being able to travel. It's like, why would I go somewhere to traumatize myself to that degree? I mean, I know it exists because I have infinite curiosity about so many things, and especially about Black history and culture. I know I would benefit on some level, but I would also be permanently traumatized by that experience. Not every person who's Jewish sees the need to go to the concentration camps. That's a counterpart of visiting a concentration camp. So I'm not going to be doing that. But this is a really good article. Thank goodness there is a lynching memorial. And this is an article from the New York Times about it. Look at the map, the lynching map, and compare it to the hate map from the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's really interesting to see where the hate groups are and how widespread they are in the United States, as well as how widespread and severe lynching in the United States has been. I just happened to pull those two maps. I knew that I wanted to show you the lynching map, and then when I was on the Southern Poverty Law Center website, I said, "Oh, wow, here's another map. Interesting to compare." There's the website for the Equal Justice Institute's lynching in America. They've done a report. They have loads and loads and loads of resources about the subject of lynching. And again, it's good for you to have that for context. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which started in the 1970s, is one of the major anti-racist organizations in the United States. They primarily work through bringing groundbreaking court cases to dismantle white supremacy in the United States. They also track hate group activity in the United States in a very comprehensive, exceedingly comprehensive way. And often when hate crimes occur, you will see people from the Southern Poverty Law Center being interviewed because they are the repository of the research and the expertise. I was looking at a piece of mail I had gotten from the Southern Poverty Law Center just last night, and I saw that they use the term white supremacy to talk about what their mission is. That is, eradicating white supremacy. So they actually know what time it is. They know what's happening. The Zen Education Project is an incredible resource. And Zen is named, the Zen Education Project is named for Howard Zen, who was a lifetime organizer and activist. You may know about his People's History of the United States. He also wrote one of my favorite books, one of those books I buy and give to people, which is called Snick the New Abolitionist.
Yep.
Snick is a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. John Lewis, Representative John Lewis, who just died, was a member of Snick, and at one point the director, our chair of Snick. And that speech that they kept citing that he gave at the March on Washington was actually the Snick speech. It was collectively written. He was the person who delivered it. Snick is my favorite civil rights organization, and I was just a couple of years too young to be involved in Snick. Howard Zen was one of the two adults who was at the founding meeting of Snick because of his deep commitment to anti-racism and the civil rights struggle. So the Zen Education Project has great resources. They do This Day in History every day, so you can find out something new about what's going on in this nation and what has gone on if you get on every day and look at their This Day in History, which is just a short, piece about what happened on that date. Teaching Tolerance is a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. It is aimed at classroom teachers, but its resources are useful to anyone who's interested in digging deep into not just racism, but all forms of oppression, including anti-immigrant hostility and attacks against the LGBTQIA community, people living with disabilities, including mental health, living with mental health issues. It's just an incredible resource. They publish a magazine that comes out twice a year. It is free to any classroom teacher, and also it's free to people who support the Southern Poverty Law Center. I was on a Zoom meeting a few weeks ago, and I mentioned teaching tolerance, and people got all bent out of shape because they didn't like the word tolerance. I don't like it either. I don't like it one bit. You tolerate a mosquito or a fly that's buzzing around. I don't like tolerance. That's a very low level. And I believe when they started teaching tolerance a couple of decades ago, I think I wrote a letter to the Southern Poverty Law Center to let them know what I thought about their choosing that name. But get past the name, their resources are incredible. And then there's the 1619 Project, which you may be familiar with, which came out last August, a year ago, and which looks at the history of enslavement in the United States and actually marks the importation of enslaved people, of enslaved Africans in 1619 as the start date for U.S. history. And I think that's quite credible. The right wing hates the 1619 Project. It is constantly being attacked. I just saw Nicole Hannah-Jones on TV this morning on MSNBC. they were talking about other stuff. But the thing is that the anchor said, you must be doing the right thing because I see how much the 1619 project is being attacked. So, you know, if the right wing doesn't like it, that there might be something good there. So it's almost 3:25, almost 3:30. And I think that it's really time for us to conclude.
And certainly, Barbara, you said you would come back at least one or more times, so that people had we had a lot of questions coming in.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, maybe the next time, and this would make my life really easy. Maybe the next time, although I may think of a few things to share with you, I bet I will. But maybe the next time you can gather up questions and we'll just do a Q&A. And then also, I mean, my technical skills are non-existent, but maybe we might look at something together. I was thinking about this earlier this morning, like maybe we might look at a piece of a documentary film or something like that and talk about that too. But I do want to be as useful to people who are interested in this subject matter as I possibly can. So getting your questions and hearing from you, your guidance will be quite helpful on that. I've enjoyed this today. I hope that other people have found it to be of value.
Oh yeah, I want to appreciate you again and focus on how generous you are with the, again, future offering of time too. So I'd like to remind people to go back, check the link in chat, I believe it is, on the Barbara Smith Caring Circle, because if you're able, I think contributing to your work is part of ending racism.
Maybe, who knows?
I think so, because you're a person of great integrity and can be trusted to be completely committed to this project and sharing your ideas and moving forward, and your work needs to be supported too. And that's one way. It's not the only way. I think we need to make a decision to make this life work, actually.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. And this is what we came up with instead of doing like more if you can, less if more if you can, less if you can't, kind of like if we were in person passing a hat or whatever for some like honorarium of a kind. So this is what we came up with. This is a mechanism. I don't have a, you know, Venmo or whatever that stuff is. So this is a fund that was set up by one of the people who's on this call, Sheila Sable, and this is a fund that has allowed me to retire, because having been an activist my entire life and writer and being committed to those things, I got to a certain point in my life called being a senior, and it was clear I would not be able to retire. So that's what this helps me to do.
Yeah, thank you so much. But yeah, and there are really many more questions. My apologies that we couldn't get to all of them, of course, because of time. So if people could hold on to those, we'll, you know.
Will they be preserved in some way? I mean,
they should be.
Is Chris able to respond to that?
I think I should be able to. I will look into it, sure. Yeah,
I would love to see them, actually. So I think this is a point where we're saying so long. I never say goodbye.
Yeah, thank you again. Yeah, well done.